Hello, James of James here, and welcome to the first episode of South Windsor. In this series, we'll use cities' skylines to explore the history and culture of Piedmont, Virginia, from the distant past into the 20th century, trying to understand together how this past shapes our modern society. This episode will focus on the native history and indigenous people of Virginia, the land they lived in, their lifeways, and what daily life would have looked like in Virginia before European arrival. Some may ask, why spend this time on indigenous history? There are two key reasons, and the first is this. Native Virginians arrived around 20,000 years ago. The first Europeans anywhere nearby were Spanish explorers passing through North Carolina in 1524. Thus, if the whole of human history in Virginia was one 24-hour day, these conquistadors arrived 35 minutes till midnight at 11:25. Just a few minutes later, at 11:42, the Constitution was ratified and George Washington was sworn in as first president. Since the overwhelming majority of Virginia's history is therefore the story of its native inhabitants, it's clearly both relevant and justified to spend time talking about their lifeways, to recognize and commemorate their ancient heritage in our homeland. The second reason for learning this history is because these indigenous Virginians are still living, some abroad and some here within the Commonwealth's modern borders, and their continued presence is an integral part of the story of our shared home. To understand the native people of Virginia, much of how they lived only makes sense if we understand where they lived. We must examine their physical context, looking at Virginia itself and what defines it as a unique place. At its most basic level, Virginia's geography is determined by two main features: the Appalachian Mountains and the Chesapeake Bay. These two geographic features shape the land between and surrounding them, which in turn impacts what thrives and flourishes there. So, to begin, let's cast our minds into ages far past when these mountains and this bay first formed. 300 million years ago, the central Pangaean Mountains formed as tectonic plates collided. As tall as the Himalayas are today, these mountains would break apart to form the Atlas Mountains of Morocco, the Scottish Highlands, and, incredibly, the Appalachians of eastern North America. 100 million years later, these mountains began to settle, eroding down as the plates drifted apart. River valleys widened into lakes, then opened into seas, eventually growing to form the Atlantic Ocean. These unbelievable geologic changes explain the incredible fossils that can be found in the Appalachian Highlands. Ancient trilobites, corals, and clams. These mountaintops were once sea floors, and the plant and animal life of these prehistoric swamps would someday become the coal seams that would characterize so much of the region's economy. 35 million years ago, a fireball appeared in the sky. Brighter than most meteors, it grew in size and intensity as it flew above dense, tropical rainforests that would later be known as Richmond, Virginia. The bolide would fly over the broad delta of the Susquehanna River and head out to sea before crashing into the shallow waters of the Atlantic continental shelf. The epicenter of the impact was very close to the port town of Cape Charles on Virginia's eastern shore, as shown in this dramatic recreation.
Astrologists report that a devastating meteor will strike the city in the near future. Residents should seek shelter immediately if any is available. A meteor strike has occurred. Avoid the impact site and head to shelter if any is available.
Two things to note about this demonstration. First, this map obviously shows modern coastlines and fields. This whole area would have been under the salt water of the Atlantic, as sea levels were considerably higher at the time. Secondly, while mods allowed me to use a meteor 2.5 times larger than the maximum size allowed in the vanilla game, the crater would have to be 15 times larger still to to reach the approximate size of the real-life Chesapeake Bay impact. The crater would form the basin of the Chesapeake Bay out of the delta of the Susquehanna River, which drained into what became the bay from the north. Thus, with the mountains in the west and the bay in the east, the geography of Virginia began to take on a more recognizable shape. Beginning in the east, rivers running down from the mountains emptied into the Chesapeake, eroding away a broad, coastal plain covered by rich, fertile soils. This plain, often called the Tidewater, extends westward to the fall line, the limit of easy navigation along much of the mid-Atlantic coast. This is less of a single hard edge, but more a narrow band where rivers drop between 50 to 30 meters in a short distance. On the James River, this band is approximately 7 miles of urban rapids overlooked by the city of Richmond, where a disused system of canals and locks used to navigate around the falls can still be seen. Many other major cities across Virginia and other mid-Atlantic states were similarly situated at the fall line. Princeton, New Jersey, Wilmington, Delaware, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Columbia, South Carolina, and Augusta, Georgia, are all similarly situated on the fall lines of their rivers. Above the fall line lies the next main regional division, the Piedmont, where our series will be set. As the land rises to meet the Appalachians, it gradually increases in roughness and elevation as the coastal plain gives way to the foothills that give the region its name. The bedrock here is more complex, weathered, and diverse, leading to a wide variety and quality of local soils across the increasingly rugged terrain. Historically, farms in this region have been smaller and have had to work around the topography of the land compared to the sprawling, flat estates that formed in the Tidewater region of the coast. Compared to the mountains above, the rocks here are highly eroded, and very few outcrops will protrude from the soil. Last, we come to the mountains and highland plateaus. The first ridge lines a traveler heading west would encounter are called the Blue Ridge, so called because of the blue tint they take on when viewed from a distance through the humid Piedmont air. Here, the power of geologic forces are on full display. Sharp knife ridges such as Seneca Rocks and impressive formations such as the Natural Bridge are found alongside ancient mountains and the waters of the New River Gorge, inaptly named as it's one of the oldest rivers on Earth. Compared to the Rockies, Alps, or Himalayas, this range is far shorter, generally around 4,000 feet or 1,200 meters, but this is primarily due to their age compared to these relatively younger formations. Across the Blue Ridge lies the Shenandoah, an ancient, fertile valley which provided easy passage from as far north as Quebec and as far south as Alabama. Its mountainsides feature caverns and hot mineral springs bubbling up, with underground rivers carving the soft sandstone and other sedimentary rock into a lovely and bountiful landscape, well loved by its many visitors and inhabitants. From this valley, the land rises again into a series of ridgelines, eventually reaching a rugged plateau in what is now West Virginia. Humans arrived in Virginia around 20,000 years ago, soon after the last glacial maximum of the last major ice age peaked, when the glaciers began to subside. Virginia looked very different at that time. Sea levels had fallen, with much of Earth's water trapped in the ice. Though the crater had hollowed out a basin, the Chesapeake Bay wouldn't form for another 10,000 years, when melting ice would flood the Susquehanna River Valley and establish this permanent inland sea. When the first indigenous people arrived and began to make their home here, the Atlantic Ocean's shoreline sat almost 40 miles further east. The broad coastal plains that served as hunting grounds for these Paleo-Indians now lie many fathoms deep under the Atlantic Ocean waters. Imagine the surprise of scallop fishermen aboard the trawler Sinmar. It's the early 1970s, and one day, while out working the usual routes, you feel a sudden, sharp tug as the dragnets catch something heavy, lodged in the sand and mud of the sea floor. Captain Sean orders the nets hauled in to clear whatever piece of debris has fouled the day's fishing. After pulling them up, tangled up inside is something no one expected. A giant skull with massive horns or tusks protruding 10, maybe 15 feet from its face. This ancient skull belongs to a mastodon, a pachyderm related to the more well-known woolly mammoth. Alongside this massive skull is another find that would be easy to miss alongside such a large find. A stone knife, clearly carefully crafted by ancient human hands, used either to hunt or to butcher this giant animal many times the size of its conqueror. At this time, early Virginians would have encountered not only mammoths and mastodons, but giant bison, animals 15 feet long with horns 7 feet wide, about twice the size of a more familiar American bison. Giant ground sloths the size of large bears range widely, eventually being hunted to extinction by these Paleo-Indian peoples. Surprisingly, horses are believed to have evolved in several breeds in North America by this time, and having crossed the ice bridge to Asia, they went extinct on their home continent, again due to human hunting, at least in some degree. As the climate was still much colder, predominant species of trees and other plants were quite different than what we see in the present. Not only would the forest have been much more old growth, but spruce and fir would predominate, giving the forest an appearance much more akin to what's now seen in northern New England and maritime Canada. As millennia passed, the climate warmed. Coniferous forest retreated northward and upward to higher elevations. In the lowlands, oak and hickory began to take their places. Closer to the coast, the well-drained, sandier soils of the tidewater favored pines adapted for the often dry soil, and in the low-lying marshes, species of cypress began to thrive. Over the course of thousands of years, ice melt from retreating glaciers began filling the Chesapeake, bringing the coastline to a recognizable shape around 3,000 years ago. At this time, although Virginia's native population was still only in the tens of thousands, their growing population pushed the limits of sustainability for a purely hunter-gatherer lifestyle. They began to settle along rivers, fish for oysters, and carve soapstone into useful objects. They began to transition into a more stationary, horticultural lifestyle, clearing fields with planned burnings and sharp stone axes, then domesticating useful strains of sunflowers, gourds, squash, and seedy grasses. It is believed that around this time, tribal identities began to solidify, and social stratification began to emerge, with elders guiding the affairs of these nascent villages, rather than the more egalitarian structure that is supposed to have existed previously. For some historical context, around the same time, Greece was in its Dark Age following the Bronze Age collapse. Ancient Britons were putting the finishing touches on Stonehenge, the first temple was being built in Jerusalem, and in Central America, the Olmecs were beginning to carve massive, highly stylized stone heads. Now that we've learned about the Virginia of eons ago in broad strokes, let's start to get specific and narrow our focus to the more recent past, and get to know a bend in the river that will someday become the town of South Windsor. Let me change gears and talk a bit about how this project started. The most obvious questions are, where are we focused in the real world, and why there in particular? The answer to the first question is pretty easy. South Windsor is a fictionalized version of South Boston, the largest community in Halifax County, Virginia. It sits about 10 miles north of the North Carolina border, roughly halfway between Richmond and Greensboro, North Carolina, or again, halfway between Raleigh and Lynchburg, Virginia. As for the town's name, I'm joining the tradition of how other city skylines creators have named their versions of real cities. Philadelphia became Franklin, New York City turned into Gramercy, and San Francisco was redubbed Santa Isidora. Thus, as Prez's New Windsor is the city skyline's equivalent of Boston, and since the real-life South Boston took its name from that city, our version will be called South Windsor. For the follow-up question of why South Boston, I'll give you the short version. As a young boy in the railroad town of Roanoke, Virginia, the 4-year-old boy personality sorter kicked in and assigned me train guy accordingly. My dad and I eventually built a model railroad that I named the South Boston Central, imagining my little steam locomotives moving boxcar loads full of goods on and off the piers of the harbor, reeking of fish guts and coal smoke. My dad thought I meant South Boston, Virginia, and though it's not a busy Atlantic seaport, the town does make for some interesting model railroading in its own right, as spurs of the Norfolk and Western and the Southern Railway crossed at the town. The South Boston Central has gone through several iterations throughout the years, but most recently I've been thinking of it as a digital model railroad. I wouldn't have to find a room big enough to hold the layout, or pack up my collection when it's time to move, not to mention the massive investments of money and time. With city skylines, I'm really only limited by my skill in the simulation. And so, after a few other attempts using maps I found on the Steam Workshop, I eventually decided to create a custom map using data from the real-world setting, so that I could truly bring my vision of the town of South Boston and its little railroad to life.
What are the 39 steps? Come on, answer up! What are the 39 steps?
The 39 Steps is an organization of spies, collecting information on behalf of the Foreign Office of...
Perhaps you're interested in doing something similar, and you're looking for some tips on making a densely forested map of your own. Worry not. I'll give a quick overview of each stage of my process. There's 13 of them, and while they're generally time-consuming, they're easy enough to explain quickly. Mapmaking for city skylines is a subject well covered at this point, so I don't want to spend too long on this process. I did come up with what I believe is an original method to easily paint forests of varying density and composition, so I will give a little bit more detail there. I also firmly believe in sharing lessons learned from your mistakes, and I'll be sure to pass along the benefit of my experience with ideas that didn't pan out. Truth be told, if you count all the missteps I made along the way, my 13 steps are probably more like, 3 times as many. So, I'm sure you're asking yourself. Sorry, I honestly don't know why I felt compelled to leave that in the final cut, but we'll keep it to the 13 steps that really shaped the final version of this map with a few what not to do pointers along the way. So, let's dig in.